Hi, everybody, and welcome back. Today, we're going to be looking at the theory of natural selection and how it falls into place when we look at the evolution of a species. It's important to note at the beginning of this video that we are going to be dealing with natural selection, which is a mechanism of evolution. I'm not going to be covering speciation in this video. There will be a separate video for how a new species arises. Keeping that in mind, I want you to remember the following thing throughout the whole video, that natural selection is a mechanism of evolution. It's like a tool that you need in order for a species to evolve. It doesn't always end in a new species arising. And so that's why I've had to separate natural selection and speciation from one another. And that's why you should know that they are not the same thing and that natural selection does not always result in a new species arising. Now, the idea of evolution and natural selection has been changing for some time, and one of the first few people to identify natural selection, but didn't really have a word for it at the time, was Lamarck. Now, Jean Baptiste Lamarck was a naturalist, and he suggested a mechanism that allowed a species to change over time and ultimately make it best suited for its environment. Now, currently, Lamarckism is not a credited source anymore, and it is no longer used to describe natural selection and evolution, but we need to learn it because it ultimately tells us what doesn't produce natural selection and why this doesn't work. And essentially, with Lamarckism, he had two laws or principles that explained his idea of evolution. And very famously, he is known for his example of using giraffes. And that's why very often you'll see a lot of giraffe imagery. And I'm going to use the giraffe as an example very soon to explain it. But essentially, if we sum that up in this picture, Jean Baptiste Lamarck would have said that long necked giraffes evolved as generations of giraffes stretched their necks to reach higher leaves. Now, if you know anything about genetics, you know that this proposes a bit of an issue because if you change yourself physically, it doesn't necessarily change your genetics. In other words, if you dye your hair pink, your children are not going to have pink hair. That's not how it works. But unfortunately, Lamarck didn't have any genetics knowledge at the time because that field of study in biology hadn't been developed yet. Instead, he had two other principles. Now, the first law is centered around the idea of use and disuse. And essentially, what Lamarck means by that is he believed that if you use a structure more, it will become more developed. And if you use it less, it will become less developed. Now, I know why this might seem like it makes sense. For example, your muscles, if you use your muscles more, they grow and they develop. And if you use them less, they essentially atrophy, which means that they get weaker, but your muscles aren't disappearing. And I think that's the important idea. What he was actually saying was it's not that you use it more and it gets better. What he's really meaning is that if you were to want to see further, if you strained your eyes to allow you to see further off into the distance, he literally means that your eyes are going to get stronger. You're going to change the physical properties of the lens in your eye, all of the nerve cells in your eye, and it's almost like you can change that. You can make it better. And that's just not possible. Genetically, that's not possible. You can't change your genes and your eyesight through wanting to see further away and using your eyes more. And that's like saying if you don't use your eyes, you're going to lose the ability to see, which is not the case at all. You could be blindfolded for 10 years, and then when you take the blindfold off, you can still have your sight. You won't have lost it in any way. The second law that's linked to Lamarckism is the law of acquired characteristics. And what that means is the characteristics like the using the structure more and making it better or using it less, that is acquired, meaning it's gained during the course of the animal's life, and then it is inherited or it's passed on to the offspring. Now, yet again, we know that this is not true because in genetics, you cannot change your genotype during the course of your life and then pass that on to your offspring. And you certainly can't choose to do that either. We know now with modern science that the only way that you can pass on any changes to your offspring is in your gametes, and it's often a result due to mutation. So it's not necessarily something that you have chosen to change about yourself. And so now, how do these two laws apply to his giraffes? And I'm going to use his giraffes as an example. So essentially, what he would have said is giraffes would have started off with a short neck, which they actually did. However, what he suggested was they used their necks more and more by stretching them. And over generations, they got longer because they needed to reach the food higher and higher. And so, what you had is a use of the neck being used more and stretching it and going further and further. And when that slightly shorter neck giraffe stretched its neck, it somehow changed itself, and that was then passed on to the next generation, and then the next generation, and each generation getting a slightly longer neck than the one before, until we end up with the giraffes that we have today with the longest necks. Now, if you know anything about biology, adding structures to an animal or any organism is very difficult when it's being added out of nothingness. That's like adding an extra vertebra bone in your spinal column, and it's just not possible. You can't think about something and then grow it. And so Lamarckism is not a credited source of evolution. Instead, the most basic and the most commonly used form is Darwinism, which is what we're going to go into next. Now, Darwinism and the idea of what we also call gradualism is a way in which to explain how evolution occurs, and it is linked to also the rate at which evolution occurs. And so Darwinism was proposed by Charles Darwin, and he spent a huge proportion of his life studying animals and figuring out exactly how they actually change over time and what's causing them to change and why are they changing. And so his idea is slightly different when it comes to the giraffes. Instead, Darwin would have said that you had long necked giraffes and they are born randomly. In other words, some giraffes have shorter necks and some giraffes have a little bit longer necks. And we can see that in humans as an example. Some humans are shorter than others, some are taller, but they're all still humans. So there's variation. And those who have the longer necks are more successful because they can eat better. They don't have to compete as much. So they produce more offspring. And any organisms that are competing with each other often die and don't survive. And so if you have a longer neck, you have a competitive advantage. And so I'm going to go step by step through natural selection in the future part of this video. But let me just break down a little bit more of this. So, sitting around Darwin's central idea is there are four main ideas that guide his explanation. Number one, more offspring are produced than needed. And we see this in many examples of animals. Often animals produce more than two offspring, which is more than is necessary, as you only need one to replace each of the parents. Now, within any species, you always need natural variation. And we see this amongst ourselves and humans, but we see that amongst animals as well. Basically, we're looking for differences in height and color and texture, and these little variations between individuals allow for evolution to take hold. Just think of humans. We have a variety of hair colors, skin colors, heights, body weights, eye colors, blood groups. All these variations improve our chances of evolving and surviving. The third important thing is that the environment creates the selective pressure. Now, what that means is, and what Darwin meant is, basically nature selects using selective pressures like predation, competition, parasitism, diseases. Essentially, there is competition between individuals within a population to survive. So they're either competing for mates, they're competing for shelter or food, and you might have a variation in your genes which makes you stronger and fitter. And that means that you are likely to resist the selective pressure and that you can be successful and that you can live. And lastly, and this is a very important one, and this was missing essentially from Lamarckism, is that the traits are inheritable. Now, Lamarck said that you acquire these inherited characteristics, but what he meant there is you've gained something in the course of your life, in your genetics, and you're giving it to your children. But Darwin is saying rather that these little variations, these little changes must happen in the DNA. They can't happen in your physical body. They can't happen in your hair color. They can't happen if you, for example, lose an arm. It doesn't mean that your children will therefore lose their arm or be born without an arm. Darwin is saying that in order for there to be a change, it must happen in the DNA, it must be genetic, and it must affect the genotype, and that is then passed on to future offspring. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the step-by-step process of natural selection using an example. So now let's look at this deer mouse example, and let's pretend that we find this population of mice and they have a dark fur color, and currently they live in a forest, and the traits that they have allow them to survive. And so in this particular area, they're probably a dark brown color. They suit the surroundings, maybe the darker areas of the forest. And right now they have variation in their colors, and some might be a little darker than others, maybe some are a little bit lighter, but they're still all a brown color. Now, let's say, for example, some of these dark brown mice, they get relocated. Maybe they're washed onto an island far away from where they used to live in the forest, and now they're on a new environment with new challenges, but also new advantages. And unfortunately, this particular island that they now find themselves on has a lighter sand. And that means that in terms of their coloring that they have, they really stand out and they're going to be fairly easy to spot to predators because they don't have anything camouflaging themselves. Now, what you have is the development of what we call favorable traits. And so at this point, when they were in the forest, they had a favorable trait that allowed them to survive. But now we've got these dark colored mice on a light colored sand. And so now this trait isn't so favorable anymore. It's becoming an unfavorable thing to have because it could lead to their possible death. Now, as I mentioned before with Darwin's ideas and his theories, he said that there is going to be genetic variation, which means that within this dark brown population of mice, there are going to be some who are lighter than others. And we can see that in humans as well. We can see it in dogs and cats. All their fur colors are not perfectly identical to one another. And that can be the case with our mice. Now, the light colored mice are not necessarily a new species, and this is really important. This is not the production of a new species. Rather, it is simply a favorable trait that's being selected for. So let's say our mice are now reproducing with one another and a gene mutation occurs. Now, that gene mutation results in this very, very light fur. And I want you to know that gene mutations are often random and they are not caused by the mouse wanting to be a different color. And so now what happens is we end up with more and more and more tan colored mice. In other words, this lighter color. And now we have all this genetic variation. We've got dark colored mice and light colored mice. And essentially, they all exist in the same place, competing for the same resources and safety as well. And I think we can see where this is going. But essentially, if you are the lighter fur colored mice, you are more likely to survive because you camouflage better. But the darker individuals don't. So now this links into these selective pressures, which we mentioned about Darwinism earlier on. And so, because the sand was a lighter color, the tan colored mice had a better chance of survival because they were able to blend into the sand. This means most of the dark mice died. Now, an example like we see here is of predation, and predators often determine a lot of evolution because those who have the unfavorable trait do not survive and they can't reproduce. So let's explain this a little bit clearly. Essentially, what you have is competition amongst organisms. Some have favorable traits, like being a tan light color, and some have unfavorable traits, who have a dark color. The ones that are tan and lighter are more likely to survive and reproduce, whereas those with the darker color are less likely to survive and therefore less likely to reproduce. Now, remember, reproduction is very important for carrying on genetics. Now, I'm going to pause there. I want to remind you that even if we removed a lot of these dark brown mice, we haven't lost the dark brown gene completely. Because if you know anything about genetics, you know about recessive and dominant traits. And sometimes a trait can be hidden and it can be masked by a dominant trait. And so it's not necessarily true that we have lost every single dark brown mouse. It could just be that all the tan mice are carrying the gene for the darker hair color, but we don't actually see it. It's not being expressed. So now we see this playing out in our next picture here, where we see there's a change now in the gene pool. So those survivors that make it to their reproductive stages, they get to pass on their genes, and the genes being those favorable colors, being the lighter of the color, but most of the survivors are tan. Now, there will be more tan mice than the darker brown mice. And this is the favorable trait that we want to pass on. And in other words, it's going to be more frequent. So the frequency of the gene has increased, and we have a bigger population of tan mice than we do the dark brown mice. Now, it's important to note that at this point, we can stop and we can say natural selection has occurred where a new trait has been selected that was favorable and it was passed on through the genetics and it's now within the population. So, if I draw a line down the middle here, that is where natural selection can end. And essentially, what it means is that you can still have dark and light brown mice. They're both the same species, and that's very important. I haven't made a new species, I've just selected a new favorable color, and they can all live still together. The next picture in our story is optional. And basically, what I mean by that is sometimes if you allow this selective pressure to go on and on and on, and you keep removing all the dark brown mice over and over again, eventually all the mice will be tan in color within a few generations as they have adapted to the environment. And the reason for that is as you slowly but surely interbreed all the mice with each other, eventually, if you keep removing the dark individuals, that gene for the dark fur will be lost. Now, I know that it can be a recessive gene, and we've spoken about this earlier in the video, but recessive genes can eventually be lost if there is nobody else in the population to join your recessive gene with, then you'll never have that trait show up again. And so that's how you could actually end up with a whole population of tan colored mice. Now, it's very important to note at this point, we have not produced a new species. All we have done is we have selected a new favorable trait or characteristic. Lastly, we need to look at artificial selection. Now, artificial selection has been happening for thousands of years, and humans have been the driving force behind it. And it's really important to note the difference in a very subtle description. And that is that when we speak about artificial selection, we are speaking about when humans select traits of animals and plants with desirable characteristics. Desirable is different to favorable. A favorable trait will allow you to survive. A desirable trait will make you more worthy of human use and benefit. And now humans have been doing this for millennia. An example, like in the photograph alongside, is how we actually ended up with modern corn. And essentially, what we did is we actually took a type of grass that made these small seed like kernels. And over time, we selected the ones that had the tightly packed kernels. We kept these and we bred them and we bred them over and over again and we interbred them. And over generations, we got more kernels until we got the modern corn that we eat today. And we eat the female version of the modern corn. And essentially, how did we do this? Well, all we did was we kept the individuals that gave us the desirable trait we wanted, which was the big kernels, the multiple seeds or kernels located on the same plant. We kept those and we interbred them. Any individuals who didn't produce these desirable traits, we got rid of them. We didn't allow them to reproduce. Now, that means that humans are playing the role of natural selector. We are the selective pressure. And it still follows the same idea that there is variation in a population. And instead of there being nature, it's humans selecting what we want to keep and what we want to get rid of. It's important to note that artificial selection doesn't improve the survivability of an organism. And so that means that sometimes humans have actually selected traits that would make an animal or a plant pretty unfavorable in their original environment. And we've actually sometimes made certain animals domesticated, and if they were ever released back into the wild, they would never really survive because they've lost all of their wild traits and characteristics that would have improved their survival. Another very famous example of artificial selection is dogs. And dogs are a perfect example of what humans have done with a species of animal. And what we did is we had some ancestral wolves. And wolves, for the most part, didn't like being around humans, but there were a few that seemed to like to settle around our campsites. It's wherever our nomadic ancestors would set up their homesteads for a short period of time, we noticed that these wolves liked to hang around us. They were a little bit softer, a little bit more approachable, less aggressive. And over time, what we did was we kept the wolves that were nice to us, that didn't bite us, and we let them breed. And if any of the puppies that were produced were aggressive and would bite us or did not protect us or help us in any way, we never kept them. We essentially removed them from the population and we only ever kept the nice, helpful animals. And that's eventually how we ended up with dogs. Now, dogs are an example of descent with modification, which I've mentioned before in other videos. But essentially, descent with modification is where you take a structure and you modify it over time. And Darwin was the originator of this idea. And so what we did is we took our ancestral wolves and we modified those wolves into all the dogs we see today. And you'll notice that there's a huge variety of dogs in different sizes and different shapes and colors. And basically, what we did is we selected what was desirable. Some dogs are working dogs, some are hunting dogs, some are companion dogs. And what that means is they've been selectively bred or artificially selected in order to fulfill a need that the human wanted to be fulfilled. And we've modified them. We've made them shorter legged, tall legged, long fur, short fur. We have created spotty versions or plain colors, like solid colors. All of these things have actually come out of the wolf genome or all of the wolf's genes. And that means that all of these variations humans have found and we have bred within our dogs and we have made them more frequent within the population. So, to sum up our whole lesson, let's do the terminology recap. So, we looked at Lamarckism. Remember, Lamarckism was the first idea that tried to explain evolution. And Lamarck used the idea of use and disuse. You use the structure more and it gets better, or you use it less and then it disappears. And because that happens during the course of your life, that will be an inherited, acquired characteristic. The key aspect here is on the word acquired, because it means you gained it during your lifetime or you lost it during your lifetime, and now your children will also have it, or maybe they won't have it. Now, Instead, we need to look more at Darwinism and natural selection. And Darwin said that there is variation in a population. Some animals are big, some animals are short, and that's a good thing because in nature you experience selective pressures, things like predation, parasitism, and disease. And so you need to resist that. Now, if we resist that, we can be successful and we can have what we call gene flow. Gene flow is essentially where organisms can mix their genetics together and everybody gets a chance and an opportunity to have a favorable trait within their genome. Now, when we speak about favorable and unfavorable traits, it always comes back to surviving. If you have the favorable trait, you survive, the unfavorable trait, you die, and then you don't get the opportunity to pass on that unfavorable trait, which is key because that's what nature's trying to do. It's trying to separate the favorable individuals and keep them alive, and the unfavorable, they die before they get the chance to reproduce. And so that whole thing culminates in what we call natural selection. And natural selection is the selective mechanism that leads to a trait being favorable, depending on the environment that we find it in. And we also looked at artificial selection. Artificial selection is when humans choose a desirable trait in an organism and we multiply it, we make it bigger, we make it more frequent. And in doing so, we can make plants suit our needs, we can make animals suit our needs, cows can make more milk, vegetables can grow bigger, they can be more juicy and they can taste better. And we can do all of that artificially. And it doesn't necessarily need to be in a lab either. And lastly, and this is something that is more implicit in the whole lesson, but natural selection results in biodiversity. It means you get more diverse species, whereas artificial selection doesn't necessarily result in this. And why is it important to maintain biodiversity? Because the more biodiversity you have, the healthier the planet, the more variety and variation there is. And if there's more variation, there's more chance for evolution to take place. Please remember that I'll be doing another video on speciation where you can look at how does natural selection factor into how we make a new species, and that will be in an upcoming video. I hope to see you all again soon and you enjoyed the lesson. I'll see you soon. Bye.